So the social scientists in the room, could you stand up so folks can see who you are? Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Managers in the room, pay attention to these folks. Seek them out throughout the day. Ask them what they do. Every single one of them does something differently, does different things. And as Cass displayed for you, thank you guys, you can sit down now. As Cass displayed, that it's an extremely diverse group. As a science liaison with the Forest Service, I've been developing a Rolodex. If you're old enough to know what a Rolodex is, sorry, ages me. But I actually have a Rolodex of social scientists throughout the region and what their specialties are. So if you have a question and you don't connect with someone throughout the day who you think might be able to help you, give me a call, and we'll network it and see if we can find a source for you. So isn't it weird that the only graph you've seen so far has been from a retired guy? Yay, John. So the next several talks are going to be about different arenas of science inquiry under that social sciences umbrella. And the idea of ethics and right or wrong and how people think through things is not something that we always think about as a social science. It's a little bit of an outlier. If you look in the textbooks on social sciences, sometimes it's not there. But I think it is a really critical underpinning of a lot of the conversations that we have. So Michael Nelson, he's a professor with Oregon State University, he's a philosopher and an ethicist, is going to talk to you a little bit about kind of how people, let me read his talk title so I don't get it wrong, Studying the Ethical Dilemmas of Natural Resources Management. So help me welcome Michael Nelson.
Thanks for the invitation to participate. Like Cheryl said, it's not usually the case that philosophy and ethics is included in the social sciences. Usually we think of philosophy and ethics as in the realm of the humanities. And so as a philosopher, one of the things I'm really interested in are arguments. And as an ethicist, I'm interested in arguments whose conclusions have words like should and ought in them, which for you who manage, that should sound very familiar. Management often ends with shoulds or oughts. So there's very nice symmetry actually between ethics as a discipline and what we think about as management. I often think of management as environmental ethics in action. And to illustrate that, I want to just use our friend, the old friend, because at the end of the day, I am just an old philosophy professor. And so I think about logic and arguments all the time. This is the world that I inhabit. It's maybe sad, but true. And think about this argument, right? Any argument whose conclusion has a word like should or ought in it cannot be arrived at by describing the world and by doing nothing but describing the world. You can't go from a series of ises and then all of a sudden magically have an ought. So any argument that ends with a prescription for action has to have, as a matter of logic, two kinds of premises: empirical premises, descriptions about the way the world is, whether those are biophysical or social, and normative or ethical descriptions. This is what we want. This is the way the world ought to be. This is what is of value. And so you have to find ways to bring these things together. And that's one of the areas that I'm interested in. I just want to give you two examples of some of the work that I've done and how this stuff kind of comes together. The first example is this example of what we in philosophy call intrinsic value. And intrinsic value is a concept that when you all talk about land management and what we ought to do and the way people value things, I hear intrinsic value all the time. You often don't point to it and call it that, but I hear this word all the time in the way we describe how it is that we ought to interact with the world. So this work comes from, I'm just really reporting on a piece that we published this summer in conservation biology. And intrinsic value can be thought of as a conceptual issue, but it can also be thought of and taken as an empirical issue as well. And it's a very old issue. This incredibly handsome man is Immanuel Kant. And Kant, in 1870, recognized that people value the world in different ways. He has different words to describe this. He said, look, people look out into the world and they describe things as either having a price or things that they don't want to say have a price. They have a dignity. He uses the word dignity. That's what I would call intrinsic value. What has a price can be replaced by an equivalent, but by contrast, that which is elevated above all price has a dignity. Luckily, Kant included all humans in the realm of that which has dignity, although he stopped there. And I'm not even sure he really did include all humans. So we think of hammers as the quintessential entity that possesses instrumental value, to think about it in contrast with intrinsic value, right? It's value because it serves a function. But that function can be replaced. The hammer breaks, you can get a new one. It's useful for what it does, and that's the end of it. Children, on the other hand, while if you have a good one, they can serve a purpose, right? You can get a tax write-off and they can mow the lawn. To reduce the value of your child to nothing but a lawnmower or a tax write-off is something you don't admit in public. Children are valuable for their own sake, not for what they do, but for what they are, and their value is not replaceable. So if you think about, if I look out and I sort of start to read and pay attention to the way that in natural resources we use this notion, we talk about intrinsic value. One of the things that led to this article was this frustration that people were saying things about intrinsic value and intrinsic value appeals, what I thought, based upon misconceptualization. You're not getting the concept right, and therefore you're saying things about it as a motivation or other things. So there was a whole, this is a Mac to PC translation issue. I'm not this artistic. To put things out of line. I'm way too anal for that. So there's a set of issues that seem to be surround intrinsic value, and I just want to give you one example of an issue that I think is conceptual. So sometimes our problems or the mistakes we make, I think, are conceptual mistakes, and then we make other kinds of claims and we motivate other kinds of actions based upon these conceptual muddles. And I just want to illustrate this with an argument, and it's a hypothetical argument, but there's nothing weird about it. You should recognize the nature of this argument. So just imagine an argument that looks like this. Many of those who oppose, premise one, many of those who oppose hunting wolves attribute intrinsic value to wolves. The attribution of intrinsic value to wolves is arbitrary, so this is the arbitrariness issue. We shouldn't seriously consider positions that are based on arbitrary beliefs. Therefore, we shouldn't seriously consider positions held by those who oppose hunting wolves. So you should recognize an argument like this, and in fact, you might recognize this very argument. So one of the things we can wonder about here is we can wonder about premise two. Is that actually true? Is it arbitrary when people assign intrinsic value to wolves or other humans or whatever? Well, I think you have to ask yourself, how do people do it? And how do philosophers do it? How has it been done for 40 years? How have people made this argument about intrinsic value? Well, usually what they do is they start with themselves. They say, well, we think humans have intrinsic value. Why do we think that? And we often point to a quality or a trait to illustrate that intrinsic value. And maybe it's something like, well, humans have interests, and maybe one of those interests is we want to avoid pain, and so we should honor that interest. If that's the quality that imbues you with intrinsic value, consistency requires that you apply that out into the world in a consistent way. Anything that possesses that quality should be attributed that kind of value. So then we start to look into the world, maybe talk to our biologist colleagues, and we say, do mammals and birds, are they sentient? And they say, yeah, they are. And it's like, wow, they would possess intrinsic value then. And then you go to the fish biologist and you say, are fish sentient? And then we find it out that they argue about this like crazy. So we're like, I'm not sure. They're kind of, maybe they do, maybe they don't. Plants and insects, maybe we don't have any reason to attribute intrinsic value to them. So notice what's going on here, right? We're taking a quality and we're just insisting that you consistently apply it out into the world. Maybe you don't like the idea of respecting interests or avoiding pain. Maybe you think, no, it's just being alive. Things that are alive should deserve intrinsic value. Well, that would, applying that consistently would mean that you would apply that to all living things. So I think you can say many things about this. You might not like these arguments. You might think they're wrong-headed. You might think these are the wrong qualities to apply. But I do not think you can say of this method of application that it is arbitrary. It is anything but arbitrary. It is rooted in systematic and rigorous application of similar qualities out into the world. So that's an example of a conceptual mistake that we make, and then we build arguments upon that conceptual mistake. So I think there's really good reasons to question the second premise, and therefore this version of the argument probably is not a very sound version of an argument. There's also an empirical way to think about intrinsic value, and that's the other thing that we did on the way in this paper. Think about a different hypothetical argument, right? That we should only adopt management policies that reflect the values of the majority of humans, since only those policies are actually going to be effective. And the majority of humans only view nature as instrumentally, not intrinsically valuable. Therefore, we should only adopt management policies based on the instrumental value of nature, since only those will be effective. Now, of course, people can get all upset about premise one, and there are all kinds of things you could say about premise one, but I want to sort of focus on premise two. Is this really true? Is it true that people only attribute instrumental value to the non-human world? This is important, and some of you know about this debate. This debate is currently pitting organizations like the Society for Conservation Biology against certain factions within the Nature Conservancy. The Society for Conservation Biology is premised upon this assumption that biological diversity possesses intrinsic value, and the Nature Conservancy, or at least certain parts of it, is sort of thinking about rebranding itself, is really focused on benefits that nature provides to humans. And there's this sort of war that's going back and forth. There's a peace at the moment, but that won't last for long. So I work with social scientists. I work with a guy in Ohio at Ohio State University. And Ohio's a battleground state, so we can think of it as fairly representative. And so we did, as part of a larger survey, we had a couple of questions on intrinsic value attribution in Ohio. And then we repeated it nationwide, and we found basically the same thing. So we included two statements and asked sort of agree or disagree 5-point Likert scale. And we really focused on wildlife. But wildlife are part of the non-human world, so we can think of this as natural attribution of intrinsic value as well. So wildlife are only valuable if people get to utilize them in some way. So 2,700 respondents, and wildlife have inherent value above and beyond their utility to people. You have to answer yes to one and no to the other for the attribution of intrinsic value. We're trying to make sure people are paying attention. So this is what we saw in Ohio, that overall Ohio residents attributed intrinsic value to wildlife at the rate of 82%. And whether they were hunters, anglers, trappers, or wildlife viewers, some sort of interactors with wildlife, there was some variation, but it's still, the most notable thing is the high rate of attribution. Even if they didn't engage in activities or self-identify that way at all, there was high attribution of intrinsic value. Whether they lived in rural communities or urban communities, there was high attribution of intrinsic value. Whether they were girls or boys, there was high attribution. Whether they were rich or poor, it drops off a little bit with age, because old people get meaner, of course. Of course that's what that means. And education seemed to be the most predictive, but still, 66% of less than high school education rate levels attributed intrinsic value to nature. I don't know why. It's not like you learn that nature has intrinsic value in college. That's not really what goes on. If anything, it's probably the contrary to that. So I think there's at least some evidence to suggest that P2 might be something we should think about a little harder. It might not be so obviously true as we take it. I know that's a deep rut. We have a tendency to really believe that without reflection. All of my students believe that. They don't believe that of themselves. They believe that of everybody else. I just magically always get the students who attribute intrinsic value in my classes. I have no idea how that, it's a prerequisite for my class. So the second example I want to give you is research we haven't yet published, but it's a different kind of a project. And it's a collection, it's an assessment of some public comments on the status of the wolves of Isle Royale on Isle Royale National Park. And so think about this argument, right? This is one way to frame, Cass talked about repurposing data. This is one way to reframe these public comments, that in the face of climate change, we're going to have to intervene at times in order to secure land health. But the public, we might believe, will not support that. They won't tolerate intervention. And that could be because they mistrust us, but it could also be because they equate healthy land with land where there is no intervention. So we could have that belief in an argument like this. And therefore, we're not going to be allowed to intervene. We're not going to be able to secure land health, and land is going to become increasingly unhealthy. You can imagine people wondering about or entertaining this argument. So again, P2, I don't plan them all to be P2, but we could go after and wonder about P2 with this data. So for those of you who don't know, Isle Royale is a national park, a federally designated wilderness area in Lake Superior. It's about 210 square miles. It's about 20 miles off of the mainland where Canada and Minnesota meet. And it's home to a single predator and single prey system, moose and wolves. It's also home to the longest continuous study of a predator-prey system in the world. And this is the product of that study up until last year. These sort of two data points, wolves and moose, relating to one another over on its way to 60 years. And we really want to focus in at the very end here, where wolves are tanking and moose are taking off. And that has created what some people call a crisis, or it raises certain questions about intervention, actually. And so one of the things we know is that there are high levels of inbreeding that are in this wolf population. So this is a classic small population, highly inbred, genetic depression showing up in things like bone deformities, asymmetrical vertebrae, and now sort of failure to reproduce. So as of last year, there were 3 wolves that were left, a mating pair and their deformed offspring. We have evidence this year that there are probably 2 that are still left. We're not for sure yet. And so what happened is in the fall of 2012, the park started eliciting public comments. And so this is sort of a timeline of those public comments, and they actually continue today, although the green represents a formal EIS statement. And so we did an analysis of the 930 public comments that came in. The stuff above the top are the different winter studies when they go out and study wolves and moose. So those are wolf-moose abundance. And so we could wonder if that changing wolf-moose demographic would change people's attitudes over time. If we kept paying attention long-term to this data set, will we see variations? So this is the email address that people wrote into. They were encouraged to make a policy recommendation. What do you want us to do about the wolves of Isle Royale? And they were given 3 options, right? Do nothing, now or ever. Let them go extinct and then reintroduce them. Genetically rescue them now. And then, because people are weird, some people were saying things like, well, don't do anything now, but don't rule out the possibility of genetically rescuing them later. So we gave them their own special category along the way. So we, ultimately we wanted to mark ones and zeros in an Excel spreadsheet to take these public comments. We trained 2 independent coders to go through and read these public comments and try to figure out not only what did people think we should do, but what kind of reasoning did they engage in. They were encouraged to justify the reason, explain why they wanted us to do one thing or another. Myself and my PhD student did the analysis. We randomly selected 50% of the sample and then trained ourselves to do this coding, did it independently, and just have recently finished starting to finish the analysis. It's very preliminary because it all shows up in pie charts at this point. So just the policy preference, what do people want us to do? This was 428 out of the 466 because 5% of the people, even some of whom wrote very long explanations of what they wanted us to do, we couldn't tell what they wanted us to do. And then some people would say things like, is this email working? And why aren't you responding to this? So of that 428, 68% thought we should engage in genetic rescue now. It was only 2% who thought we shouldn't act now, but we shouldn't rule out the possibility of action in the future. And 18% said let them go extinct and then reintroduce them. So only 12% were no intervention now or ever. So one of the ways to divvy this up is to think that 88% of people, even though they had different ideas about intervention, were at least willing to entertain, if not encouraging, intervention in this situation at least. And only 12% were really strict non-interventionists, even in a national park, even in a federally designated wilderness area. So the other thing we wanted to know is why? How did they justify their reasoning? And this is where, as an ethicist, I started thinking about moral theories. People appeal to what I would call moral theories to try to justify or explain why we should do something. So sometimes when they're asked, what should be done about the wills of Isle Royale, they'll make reference to the consequences. Well, if we don't intervene, that'll affect the science. Or if we don't intervene, then more of something will suffer. It's all about the consequences of the action. So some people are very consequentialist in their thinking, utilitarian in their thinking. But other people appeal to higher authorities to help them make decisions. Sometimes those higher authorities are God, not in our sample, but at other times. Sometimes it's human authorities, do what the scientists think is best. And sometimes it's the authority of nature, do that which is natural. And then some people are really interested not in the consequences or high authorities, but did you adhere your policy to, did you respect the rights of something that possessed rights? Or did you act in a caring way? Did you manifest certain virtues in your actions? So those are those three dominant moral frameworks we were looking for. And then we were matching up those moral frameworks with a different policy preference. So when we could identify a dominant moral framework, this is how it broke down across policy preferences. This is probably not a surprise. We tend to think of conservation as very consequentialist or utilitarian oriented. We're conditioned to think that way, and that is, of course, what we saw. But we saw other things too, and that's what's probably important to notice. People think in other ways as well, which implies that if the only thing you appeal to are the consequences of certain policies, you may miss people who think other things are important. So there's a lot of external authority appeal, and most of that was natural law, do that which is natural. And then some people it's just really hard to figure out what's driving them. Some people are many of us are very pluralistic in our thinking. So if you look at the interventionists and the non-interventionists, they think in very different ways. Remember, these are big and small groups. But the interventionists tended to be very utilitarian, and the non-interventionists tended to be very natural law theory. But notice there's a mixing. So some people who were appealing to do that which is natural thought we should intervene, that was the right thing to do, even though they were natural law theorists. And we might tend to think that all natural law theorists would be opposed to intervention. But that's not really what we saw here. The other thing that we noticed, and I think we all need to get a lot more familiar with this concept and take it more seriously, is a justice appeal. Many people actually saw this as a matter of justice. We tend to think of justice as applying only within the human realm. But that is not how people are starting to think about the notion of justice. There's a notion of justice and just interactions between the human and the non-human. So we actually had to insert this. As we started coding these things, we started seeing this pop up, so we backed off. And we thought about, we need a justice column, because we're seeing this too much to ignore. And mostly it's this idea of restorative justice, that we broke it, we should fix it. And that's what a restorative justice, one way to articulate that. So 18% of the total population that we did an assessment on appealed to justice. A pretty significant number of people were appealing to justice. Interestingly, and I have no idea what to make of this, all of them were in the interventionist camp. So the non-interventionists did not seem to be interested in justice, did not make a counter-justice appeal. It was really in this interventionist camp. Those were the people who were thinking about this as a matter of justice. So I asked the person who was making the graphs to make a pie chart of that. I probably could have done that one myself, actually. This is all new to me. So I think in this case, too, there's reasons to wonder about this, that is it really the case that we can say in a blanket way that the public will not tolerate intervention? I think the answer to that's probably no, but it's going to be highly dependent. It's probably going to depend on why. Why do you want to intervene? What's the purpose of that intervention? And that's going to make a big difference. Notice one of the things that's interesting about this one is the intervention isn't necessarily for human benefit. It's for the benefit of the population or the island or something that's non-human, and people are willing to entertain this kind of intervention. So there's, again, reason to question that premise and that argument. And that's it. That's all I wanted to do.